This is the Scaling Secrets podcast, and Anna Levy Warren is here from organizationaltutors.com. She is born and raised in New York City, and she is all about clinical psychology. She's a doctor. She has a PhD in clinical psychology, and she is the founder of Organizational Tutors, which is a network dedicated to helping individuals with executive functioning difficulties and complex learning profiles. And she has all sorts of accomplishments. She's a published author, a licensed psychologist, and co-founder of Dwellness, which provides in-home therapy and teletherapy. And we also want to make sure you mention the company Steel Advising as well. But enough from me. Dr. Anna, we introduced you a little bit. What did I leave out, or what can you say about just your elevator pitch and your focus and your passion these days?
Great question. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I came to an entrepreneur sort of situation backwards. I just found myself falling in by doing neuropsychological assessments and recognizing that there was a gap in the field. We just didn't have a way of understanding people with complex learning needs and taking care of them by taking the information we had from a clinical setting into the home. So about 20 years ago, I just started doing it, and I kind of grew into the organizational tutors business, named by friends sort of over dinner and drinks, because I didn't know what a web address was at the time or know how to find a domain name. And then those other companies grew out of needs that weren't being met at organizational tutors. So Steel Advising is adults coming to us and saying, can I have tutoring? And my thinking, you don't need tutoring, you need something different. That's not the same. And Wellness in-home therapy was meant to find a space for people who needed more than just coaching and tutoring. So it all just happened very naturally to me, and I didn't really know what I was building until I was in it, but it's been an incredible opportunity for growth personally and in terms of building a pretty extraordinary network of people.
Well, that's wonderful. And we always worry about kind of falling into things in a bad way, right? Like if you jump into a career you don't like, or you're impressing people you don't like, but then when you're falling into the entrepreneurial calling, and a result of like the little micro commitments leads to helping people and building these companies, then that's the good kind of falling into. And so as far as helping us understand some of these things that you do, like you mentioned about there's like the complex thing that you solve, and then also how there's all these in-home therapies. So what is this gap that you were talking about that was not being filled, and how do you fill this gap now?
Great question. So when we do, whenever someone has a challenge in school, like they're having trouble reading or they aren't paying attention, there's lots of different ways that, or they're struggling in math, we always understand why, right? From an early academic, learning profile. And the way we often figure that out is by doing a neuropsychological assessment, and there's all different kinds of ways of doing those assessments, batteries of tests. And as clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists, that's a responsibility that we have to, in part of our licensure, to understand and be trained in doing that. So when we get that, and oftentimes the more casual way of talking about it is IQ tests, right? That's a part of that kind of profile, not the ones online, but like the real ones done by a clinician. And you get all this incredible information about how your mind works, right? What are your strengths? What are your challenges? What are the difficulties you have? How is that relative to other people? So much information. And sometimes if you have one of those challenges, for example, you have ADHD, right? You have an attentional challenge, that's going to make it hard for you to do anything about it. And our neuropsychologists can tell you what you should do. But 20 years ago, there weren't really people who understood executive functions, which is sort of the CEO of the brain and helps you delegate and manage time and do all these wonderful things, which I can always mention more about later. But basically, it's a fundamental problem that a lot of these disorders actually end up having as a part of it, that your executive functions are challenged. And there wasn't anyone to kind of come in and do the implementation. So I started moving from doing the testing to doing the implementation. Now it's a very popular term and lots of people do it, but at that time there really wasn't anyone to step in, think about that kind of complex learning profile, which is what I called it, like a complex learning need, neurodiversity, different kinds of profiles, and make those changes happen at home. And also leave parents, especially for smaller children, with the strengths of understanding how to implement that themselves, right? How do I learn that so I'm not just relying on a coach, but actually getting the information I need to help my child, and so that they get those skills internalized and they can do it for the rest of their lives. And I find that with the adults, oftentimes they just missed that window, right? Like I'm, in my 40s, we didn't have that kind of feedback when I was a kid. So in the same way, that kind of implementation. So sometimes people are actually, there was different, stimulation needs in terms of phones and internet. So, what's happened has really changed over time. So now we have a lot of adults coming to us saying, I didn't realize that I had these challenges and now I need help with them.
And it seems like we live in a more kind of data centered kind of life now where, and you hear about this sometimes, right? Where like this friend or this celebrity doesn't know that they had dyslexia or
Mhm.
ADHD until their 40s and 50s. And it's like you lived all these decades of making life more miserable than it had to be, right? You could have used these other techniques to learn better in school. You could have sat closer to the front of the class if you had a vision problem of some kind. And so it seems like now that we have these tools available to us, now we can maybe solve the problem, right? And get to the root cause, and we don't have to suffer. We don't have to ignore the problem. And then even if we do get diagnosed with some kind of neurodiverse thing, it's not like bad per se. It's just now that we know what we have, now we can use some of these techniques that are available to us. And you mentioned this concept of like the executive term. So can you kind of unpack that, explain that for us?
Sure. I mean, executive functions is a very popular term now, and I think it's, unfortunately not a completely 100% everyone agrees term, but ultimately what we know is it's an interrelated set of cognitive processes, which what I mean when I say that is it's not just in one part of the brain. Sometimes when we talk about short-term memory or long-term memory, we identify one part of the brain. This is it's a construct that's a little bit wider than that. And it means that basically, I like to say it's a navigational system or air traffic control. It's delegating, it's managing, and underlying that, it's a sequencing, right? It's cognitive flexibility, cognitive control, and working memory. And then organizing and sequencing comes from that. And then the way it manifests, which is what most people talk about it, right, is time management, prioritization, how you attend to things. Like there's all kinds of components that impact our daily lives. So that's really how we like to think about it. And just for working memory, because it's an easy one to pop out, I like to think about like a server at a restaurant and somebody, going around the table, people who have very strong working memory, since it's like the post-it system in our brain, they go around and take your order and they don't even need to use a pen and paper. And you say like, oh, I'm gluten-free and I'm dairy-free and hold the onions. And you're looking like that's no way that's going to happen. But they actually do get your order right. It's because they have a really strong working memory and they're like putting all that information on post-it notes and then they're sending it out the way it needs to be sent out. And then they're receiving it back in, no problem. Where you might have somebody else who goes around the table and is like, did you say Diet Coke? And you're like, Diet Coke. And then they write it down and they still seem to not get it right in the end. It's because they don't have that internal post-it note system. It's not as strong. So when they take in the information, they actually have to physically write it down because it's not going to stick in the same way. So just think about the impact of that in school, right? And then you can see how working memory challenges really can manifest across so many different realms.
And so when people come to you to develop some of these things, right, such as the working memory, there are kids and there's adults, is it usually like I want to solve this problem that I know I have, or is it like an improvement, like I want to have the better memory and be better at my job?
Usually it come because they're having a pretty like concrete challenge that's manifesting in their real lives. And what I often see is that it reaches a certain point, like what we call a cognitive overload, where they just get to the point where whatever challenge level they had, whatever relative weakness they had, they cross over a line. So sometimes that happens in middle school, but sometimes you're doing great until, all of a sudden you have 3 children and you're working a job and you're having marital distress, right? So then all of a sudden, you're forgetting to buy milk every time it's asked of you, or you're not signing your kids up for things you promised you would, or you start to fall down on deadlines at work. And, honestly, that can happen to anyone. Like executive functions can be challenged for anyone when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're anxious during a global pandemic, that it's not that anyone can get stressed, but some people sort of at baseline have that level of distress. So oftentimes people are coming when they've reached, it's like sort of crossed over and they're having functional problems. They're not performing in their life in a way that makes them feel good, or they're getting feedback from others that their approach and process to what they're doing isn't working.
And it's important to have awareness of this, right? Of this idea you're talking about of like things are okay until just enough, until you get to that breaking point. And you're making me think about like during the pandemic, I wasn't really overall that stressed, but a few years before, just enough things piled up where I noticed what you're talking about. I felt like like some percentage of my CPU was taking up, and like 80% was just taking up over this repetitive task. And I felt like I was only like using 20% of my brain at what I needed to be using it at. And so that's good to be aware of that. If we're just kind of, as you said, if we're forgetting things, missing things, not really doing the activities that we need to be doing, then it's maybe because we just have this overload. And so what can be done? Like, do you have any fun stories to share as far as when someone came to you and like took some of these assessments and were figured out like the solution to move forward?
I mean, yeah, there's so many examples, and I'm thinking about in terms of your audience. I think it happens a lot with just even sort of like CEOs, right? Like we get a lot of people that come, or lawyers that come to us and sort of say, I was doing great. And then all of a sudden, I'm not able to actually get things done in the same way. Like I'm slowing down, right? Or I'm missing things. And, there's something funny about saying, oh, do you use a calendar? Oftentimes people talk about a to-do list. And I know this is a very controversial topic, but I don't believe in to-do lists, not because I don't love them and not because they're not good for me, but oftentimes to-do lists are actually a list of things that overwhelm you, make you anxious, and that you believe you should do but are not doing. And so they cause a pretty vicious cycle. And if you don't have executive function challenges and you're not stressed, go ahead, use a to-do list. It's beautiful. But ultimately, when you're having these challenges, people come to me and they say, hey, I've been using my to-do list. I can't get anything done. And I'm like, that's because it's a list of things that are making you worried. So instead, let's get rid of the to-do list. It's a brainstorm. And then everything should have a home. Everything should have a home in your home. Where are your keys? Where are your wallet? Where do they go? Everything should have a home in your calendar. When are you going to do it? And then to think so intentionally about why you're doing it at that time. I don't know if anyone's read like Daniel Pink's books. When was great. It's like when you do things is actually really important, and tracking how your brain works and when you're on fire and want to do intense things versus when you should go take a break and do a workout is life changing, actually. And so if you go ahead and think about, when do you want to write the presentation that's going to be, 30,000 people are going to be listening to you versus when do you want to write the email to your mom? Don't do that. Don't write the email to your mom at the time that's most important. So I'd say, the way that we think about those things, even though we think we know that, actually internalizing that and making the changes that allow us to be intentional about those decisions are game changers. And I could tell endless stories of little examples of those things, of when we make changes to our actual schedule based on intentional decisions about when we function best, and how that changes your life really in terms of your productivity and your attention, your efficiency, your effectiveness. So it's actually taking the time to do the labor of that intentional work. Most people don't think about it. They just throw things in their calendar or be like, oh, my assistant put a thing in there. And it's like, well, why did they put the appointment at 4 o'clock? Is it a big meeting? Don't make decisions at 4 p.m. That's a terrible time to make decisions. Make decisions at 11 a.m. So that's the kind of thing that I believe has been most impactful to people's lives.
And I think that that's huge. And I completely agree with you that the time of day and what's important, what's a priority. I think all that's huge. And we all know someone like that. Remember, we've been someone like that has the long to-do list that ends up being a worry list. And it's like the way you describe it, it's like, of course it is counterproductive, right? Because you look at this thing, you get stressed just looking at it. And then the best case scenario is maybe you chop through some of these tasks, but you feel horrible doing it. And then the next day when it comes to chop through some more tasks, you think, yesterday I had this really just painful experience. And I was even more stressed out jumping into that. Why would I want to just continually put myself through that torture? And so I love some of these things that you're saying. And what comes to mind is things like that Eisenhower Square, right? Which is all revolves around what do I do now versus all the other things that do later, have someone else do all that sort of stuff. And then you say there's also the factor of having the awareness and maybe even probably like the experimentation, right? Of just saying like, let me try doing these tasks in the morning, or do I work better on these hours? Or there's like the administrative tasks versus kind of the deep work. That's all things that since we kind of live in this more modern day and age, or we can maybe do remote work or work our own hours, or just wake up early or work later, or just figure out what works well for us. That way you don't have to force it, and that way it doesn't have to be so dang hard. And so since this is the Scaling Secrets podcast, I definitely want to make sure to jump into what you've been doing well as far as scaling, and maybe what's been a challenge for you. So what do you have to say about growing these amazing companies that you have, and getting the messaging and the awareness? What have you been going through as far as scaling?
Yeah, what's interesting to me is because I didn't, as I said, I fell into this a little bit. I didn't have the expertise of scaling a business. Many people came on the market doing a similar thing from me 15 years later, but they, really launched with a team, and they grew their companies in an impressive way that I really took note of. Where what I think I did well is I've always had incredible people around me. So I'm, as a psychologist, assessing people, finding good people, smart people, honest people has been, one of my gifts, and also one of the things that makes my life so great is that I'm surrounded by incredible experts, right? The people that are my teams, I trust everyone so completely. I love the way their minds work. I learn from them. It's beautiful. And our supervisory model actually like keeps us all really tightly in touch. So I feel like I've done culture and community and connection and human to human interaction beautifully. And that's allowed us to grow so naturally. And then a pandemic happened, and I was like, oh, I should probably think about marketing for the first time ever. Everything was word of mouth for me. I should probably think about intentional messaging. I should probably redo my website that had been done by a friend 10 years ago. And I found that that was just, taking what was, it felt like a small, close, connected company, getting bigger and bigger, and then thinking about how we enter new marketplaces and do market comps and think about the way that we bring this energy and this culture to new places has been really challenging for me. And I'm very picky about who I want to work with because I don't want to do classic PR. I want to educate people. I want to help people. I'm a psychologist in my heart. That's how I came into this. And so sometimes it does feel like there's a conflict between, margins and assessment of how I grow and scale and what my core values are. And so sometimes I've really been in a bind in those moments. And it's been a real journey for me to figure that out.
And that's interesting to think. I've never heard it explained in that way of sometimes you're kind of battling a little bit, right, with your ambition and you're wanting to scale versus kind of what your core values are and seeing, well, is there overlap? Do I say yes or do I say no to this opportunity? And you also mentioned, just kind of like recapping, digesting here, you also mentioned about pandemic, how it's changed so many things and it was probably stressful in the moment, but coming out of it, so many things have improved, right? Like I was telling my wife the other day, like, it's guaranteed almost any business or restaurant has like a mobile ordering and it has a menu. Like some positives came from the pandemic, and you could almost look at a website or a social media post and just almost tell by looking at it if it was pre or post pandemic, just based on just how like dialed in some of these things were. And then you mentioned about how you say judge people. That always sounds bad, but like you analyze people and figure out if they're a good fit for you. And so what do you like look for? Because you could think about, well, if there's someone who you think of if they're a good fit for your team, you look for certain principles? Do you look for like honesty, positivity, if they cause drama, if they do what they say, or like what or is it like intuitive? What when you say, is this person a good fit for my team or not? What are the kind of the deciding factors?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I hope I'm never judging people. So I'll say, my thought is actually that
Well, there's got to be
um,
a better term, but
term, right? Like, I think when I'm asking people always, and the thing that's most important to me and that I test for in every interview is, do you know yourself and are you open to feedback? Those are probably my two most important things. It's not just authenticity, but it's self-knowledge. Because if you know yourself and you're open to feedback and you're open to that kind of growth, there's most things we can do. We can figure this out, right? If I tell you that I'm struggling with something that you're doing and you can recognize it in yourself, take that in and grow from it, we'll keep growing together. But if you get defensive, right? So I always look for, I'll give an example. I always look for a problem on a resume. So I'll always look for a grammar error. And I'll say, do you mind if I give you some feedback on something I saw in your materials? Most people will say yes, but some people, when you say like, oh, I just want to point out that there's actually like, you're missing a period here. They'll be like, oh, well, the formatting changed and, sorry, it was a miss, but like, I like it's on the other version, it's fine. You're done. Like, I'm not interested in that communication. The only thing I want to hear, and that is, thank you so much for telling me. That's going to make it easier for me to move on and get something else. And I really appreciate that feedback. And what that tells me is that that person can take in some, and that's a very small example, but I look for things that may touch must hit a button in them because I want that kind of exchange. So transparency, honesty, yes, all of those things, expertise in this field, but really capacity to learn and grow, which to me means know yourself, be able to take in feedback and to know what's yours and to know what the other person's. Because if you confuse those things, then you can go around blaming everybody for the rest of your life. Well, she was just rude, and that's why I didn't get the job. It was her. Okay, no problem. But that's not going to somebody I want on my team.
And what I'm hearing from that is boundaries, right? Like that seems like that's like psychology 101, right? And boundaries, what's good about them is they go both ways, right? There's intruding on what someone else thinks, and if someone tells you something, how much of that can you let in? And yeah, and it all stems from childhood. And you're making me think that, like in my family, if you'd even bring up like such and such subject, if you even started some kind of sentence, then it would be get yelled at, and that's kind of immature, and that's not a good way to communicate or operate or be a team. And it just seems like, especially I don't know what changed, but in the recent last few years, just in the world, it just seems to be just like better if someone says something, maybe just in me, if I used to get insulted by someone just saying some kind of sentence and I feel wrong and I think about it all day long, and now I just think like, okay, well, thank you for the feedback, and there's not a reason to bring emotion into it necessarily if someone's giving you information, if that emotion is not helpful. You don't have to have these kind of repeated knee-jerk reactions. And we're all here to, be enlightened and grow more. And that's why you do things like build your business and scale it and get the messaging, get the word out. And so as far as the future and moving forward, what has you excited? What are you building and growing towards?
I mean, I'm really growing towards accessibility. So, like, that's the thing that's most important to me. I know some people, I really want to have, right now we're in big cities, which is great, but I really want to be reaching people who need this kind of support and work who wouldn't otherwise get it, and to be able to have a sliding scale that really allows for access for anyone who needs these kind of services. And we've launched, pilot programs in the past, which have an accessibility model where anyone can sort of pay what they can afford to pay. And I would like that to be half of our business within the next 5 years, so that we're really keeping true to the values of making sure we're strengthening executive functions and providing psychoeducation, helping kids with complex learning needs, helping adults with complex learning needs, and not having the money actually guiding the way. What's been, interesting for me to realize is sometimes having that money within the company to play with and put back in is a better model than building a whole new nonprofit or getting donations or having, an open platform for people to communicate their financial needs. So that's been a real learning curve for me too. And speaking of your previous question, is to figure out how to do this well, to figure out how I'm going to have my vision actually reach the goal that I want without all of my previous beliefs getting in the way. I've really had to question some of the things that I brought to the table to begin with about what I thought was the right way to do it.
You're evolving, questioning your beliefs. And I hope that
Yes.
we all are as well. And so if someone here has been listening to this podcast and they've gotten some ideas, they've got some insights, how do they know if they fit into one of these buckets as far as a prospect for one of these companies? And what's the solution? How do they reach out and take the next step?
Well, thank you for asking. I think if you have a family member or you yourself has a complex learning profile, which means, a diagnosed learning disability or ADHD, and you want additional support, that Organizational Tutors supplies, sort of provides that kind of support for families, kids of all ages. And if you're, in the business world and you're struggling with these same kinds of executive functioning challenges, that's deal advising. And if you really have in New York State in particular, if you have a home-based need and want to think in sort of creative ways about getting therapeutic support, that's wellness therapy. So those are the ways in which we support people at the moment. And I appreciate you asking.
And I appreciate you telling. So we said organizational tutors, still advising, and then what's the dwell?
Dwellness therapy, wellness in your
Wellness
dwelling.
Okay, so it's wellness therapy. And so thank you for being here and just kind of raising the awareness and just about some of these things that we need to be doing and thinking about and being aware of, and for sharing your scaling secrets. And since you are a thought leader, right, you're by being on this podcast and by being a business owner and reaching out. And it's always fun to hear from a thought leader as far as a quote or lesson that can really just get us pumped up and excited for the day ahead. So does anything come to mind, float to the surface of your mind as far as a quote or lesson that you can share with us today?
Oh, I wish I'd been a little more prepared for that one. I have so many quotes on top of mind. I think that,
But it's way more fun to put you on the spot instead of being prepared, right?
I really, the truth is that the most important thing that I learned, I used to tell everyone to meditate, and I never did it myself. And so it's actually the last message I would say is taking moments to breathe during the day could not be a more life-changing and important message. So it's not a quote, but it is a takeaway of, like, even if you can't do the traditional meditation, taking three breaths, taking five breaths when you're having a hard moment is a totally life altering experience. And I had to really do it to believe it and have it change my life. And it has.
Because some things are counterintuitive, right? And sometimes you hear advice and pass it along, but you don't apply it yourself. And there
Right.
was some story about like when the back in the old West days when they chase a fugitive, they would like ride the horses for an hour and then rest them for an hour, and they would always catch the criminals. I don't know how true that is, but I always tell myself that whenever I'm neglecting the self care, the meditation, the mindfulness, the quiet time, just we think that we can just barrel ahead for hours on end, but if we take these the small moments as you're saying here just to kind of reset relax and get our mind right, then in the long term that will pay off. So Anna Levy Warren, it's been fabulous speaking with you, and people should check out these three companies including Organizational Tutors, and thank you for stopping by, and it's been lovely speaking with you.